for the dancing, haven't they? Well, hello there. It's Val, Frank, and our friend Paddington here, ready for our story. I hope you're all feeling well, and I hope you're all keeping safe. So, we've got our friend Paddington. I've got my Paddington ears on. It must be time to continue our serial story. Now, do you remember last time? Paddington had an adventure in the London Underground, didn't he? He got into trouble with the inspector. He nearly landed on a very fat man, didn't he? And he got chased by a lot of dogs because he had a bit of bacon in his suitcase. So today we're going to start chapter 4. I can't believe we're getting through this story so quickly. So let's start. I'll put Paddington and our friend Frank here and they can listen to the story. Here we go, chapter 4. And it's all about a shopping expedition. The man in the gentleman's outfitting department at Barcudge's held Paddington's hat at arm's length between thumb and forefinger. He looked at it distastefully. I take it the young gentleman will not be requiring this anymore, madame, he said. Oh, yes, I shall, said Paddington firmly. I've always had that hat, ever since I was small. But wouldn't you like a nice new one, Paddington? Said Mrs. Brown. The best. Paddington thought for a moment. I'll have one the worst, if you like, but that's my best hat. The salesman shuddered slightly and, averting his gaze placed the offending article on the far end of the counter. Albert, he beckoned to a youth who was hovering in the background. See what we have in size 4 7/8. Albert began to rummage under the counter. And now, while we're about it, said Mrs. Brown, we'd also like a nice warm coat for the winter. Something like a duffel coat with toggles down it so that he can do it up easily. And we'll have a plastic raincoat for the summer. The salesman looked at her haughtily. He wasn't very fond of bears, and this one especially had been giving him queer looks ever since he'd mentioned that wretched hat. Has Madame tried the bargain basement? He began. Something in government surplus. No, I haven't, said Mrs. Brown hotly. Government surplus indeed. I've never heard of such a thing. Have you, Paddington? No, said Paddington, who had no idea what government surplus was. Never. He stared hard at the man, who looked away very uneasily. Paddington had a very persistent stare when he cared to use it, and it was a very powerful stare, one which his Aunt Lucy had taught him, and he always used it on special occasions. Now, would you like to look at Paddington's hard stare? Come on, I'm going to show you. I hope you can see the picture. Look, there it is. Paddington's hard stare. Oh my goodness. He looks cross, doesn't he? I don't think I'd like to make Paddington cross, not when he's got a stare like that. Oh. Mrs. Brown pointed to a smart blue duffel coat with a red lining. That looks like the very thing, she said. The assistant gulped. Yes, madame, certainly, madame. He beckoned to Paddington. "Come this way, sir." Paddington followed the assistant, keeping 2 feet behind him and staring very hard. The back of the man's neck seemed to go a dull red colour, and he fingered his collar nervously. It must be Paddington's hard stare, mustn't it? As they passed the hat counter, Albert, who lived in constant fear of his superior and who had been watching the events with an open mouth, gave Paddington the thumbs up sign. Paddington waved a paw. He was beginning to enjoy himself. I think he's enjoying getting his own back on that shop assistant, isn't he? He allowed the assistant to help him on with the coat and then stood admiring himself in the mirror. It was the first coat he had ever owned. In Peru, it had been very hot, and though his Aunt Lucy had made him wear a hat to prevent sunstroke, it had always been much too warm for a coat of any sort. He looked at himself in the mirror and was surprised to see not one, but a long line of bears stretching as far as the eye could see. In fact, everywhere he looked there were bears, and they were all looking extremely smart. "Isn't that hood a trifle large?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Hoods are being worn large this year, madame," said the assistant. "It's the latest fashion, you know." He was about to add that Paddington seemed to have a very large head anyway, but he changed his mind. Bears were rather unpredictable. You never quite knew what they were thinking, and this one in particular did seem to have quite a mind of his own. "Do you like it, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Brown. Paddington gave up counting bears in the mirror and turned round to look at the back view. "I think it's the nicest coat I have ever seen," he said. After a moment's thought, Mrs. Brown and the assistant heaved a big sigh phew, of relief. "Good," said Mrs. Brown. "That's settled then. Now there's just a question of a hat and a plastic mackintosh." She walked over to the hat counter, where Albert, who could still hardly take his admiring eyes off Paddington, had arranged a huge pile of hats. There were bowler hats, sun hats, trilby hats, berets, and even a very small top hat. Mrs. Brown eyed them doubtfully. "It is difficult," she said, looking at Paddington. "You see, it's largely a question of his ears. They do stick out rather." "Well, you could cut some holes for them," said Albert. The assistant froze him at a glance. "Cut a hole in a Barkridge's hat!" he exclaimed. "I never heard of such a thing." Paddington turned and stared at him. The assistant's voice trailed off. "I'll go and fetch my scissors," he said. "I don't think that will be necessary at all," said Mrs. Brown. "It's not as if he had to go and work in the city, so he doesn't want anything too smart. I think this woolen beret is very nice, the one with the pom-pom on the top, and the green will go well with his new coat, and I'll stretch it so he can pull it down over his ears when he gets cold." Everyone agreed that Paddington looked very smart, and while Mrs. Brown looked for a plastic mackintosh, he trotted off to have another look at himself in the mirror. He found the beret was a little difficult to raise, as his ears kept the bottom of the hat firmly in place. But by pulling the pom-pom, he could make it stretch quite a long way, which was almost as good. It meant, too, that he could still be polite without getting his ears culled. The assistant wanted to wrap up the duffel coat for him, but after a lot of fuss it was agreed that, even though it was a warm day, he should wear it. Paddington felt very proud of himself, and he was anxious to see if other people noticed. So that's what he would have looked like. That's his new duffel coat with the toggles. Except he wouldn't have had this hat on. He would have the green hat with all the pom-poms on it. I'm sure that Paddington would have looked really smart. We'll bring him back. Now, where were we? After shaking hands with Albert, Paddington gave the assistant one more long, hard stare, and the unfortunate man collapsed into a chair and began mopping his brow as Mrs. Brown led the way out through the door. Barkridge's was a very large shop, and it even had its own escalator as well as several lifts. Mrs. Brown hesitated at the door and then took Paddington's paw firmly in her hand and led him towards the lift. She'd had enough of escalators for one day. Actually, do you know what, guys? I think she probably remembered what happened at the London Underground. Do you remember with that escalator when Paddington was going up and down again? But to Paddington, everything was new, or almost everything, and he liked trying strange things. After a few seconds, he decided quite definitely that he preferred riding on an escalator. They were nice and smooth, but lifts, well, where to start? It was full of people carrying parcels and all so busy that they had not any time at all to look at a small bear. One woman even rested her shopping bag on his head and seemed quite surprised when Paddington pushed it off. Then suddenly, half of him seemed to fall away and the other half just stayed where it was. Just as he had got used to that feeling, the second half of him caught up again and even overtook the first half before the doors opened. Do you know what? I think that Paddington, when he's on the escalator, you know when it goes up and down really fast, I bet he's got like that queasy feeling in your tummy that you get when you're riding the escalator. I bet that's what it is. Now, where were we? It did that 4 times on the way down, and Paddington was glad when the man in charge said it was the ground floor and Mrs. Brown let him out. She looked at him closely. Oh dear, Paddington, you look quite pale. Are you all right? I feel sick, said Paddington. I don't like lifts and I wish that I hadn't had such a big breakfast. Oh dear, said Mrs. Brown, looking around for Judy. Will you be all right sitting here for a few minutes while I go and find Judy, she asked. Paddington sank down onto his case, looking very mournful. Oh, mournful's another word for sad. Even the pom-pom on his hat went limp. Oh no, poor Paddington. I don't know whether I shall be all right, he said, but I'll do my best. I'll be as quick as I can, said Mrs. Brown, and then we can take the taxi home for lunch. Paddington groaned. Oh, poor Paddington, said Mrs. Brown. You must be feeling bad if you don't want any lunch. At the word lunch again, Paddington closed his eyes and gave an even louder groan. Oh! Mrs. Brown tiptoed away. Paddington kept his eyes closed for several minutes, and then, as he began to feel better, he gradually became aware that every now and then a nice cool draft of air blew over his face. He opened one eye to see where it was coming from, and noticed for the first time that he was sitting near the main entrance of the shop. He opened his other eye and decided to investigate. If he stayed just outside the glass door, he could still see Mrs. Brown and Judy when they came. Then, just as he bent down to pick up his suitcase, everything went black. "Oh dear," said Paddington. "Now all the lights have gone out." He began groping his way with outstretched hands towards the door. Sorry, that should have been not hands. Outstretched paws towards the door. He gave a push where he thought it ought to be, but nothing happened. He tried moving along a wall a little way and gave another push. This time it did move. The door seemed to have a very strong spring on it, and he had to push very hard to make it open, but eventually there was a gap big enough for him to squeeze through. It clanged shut behind him, and Paddington was disappointed to find that it was just as dark outside as it had been in the shops. Oh my goodness, Frank, Paddington, I wonder what on earth is happening. We'll have to read on and find out. Where were we? He began to wish he'd stayed where he was. He turned round and tried to find the door, but it seemed to have disappeared. He decided it might be easier if he got down on his paws and crawled. He went a little way like this when his head came up against something very hard. He tried to push it to one side with his paw, and it moved slightly, so he pushed it again. Suddenly, there was a noise like thunder, and before he knew it, a whole mountain of things began to fall on his head. It felt as if the whole sky had fallen in. Everything went quiet, and he lay where he was for a few minutes, his eyes tightly shut, hardly daring to even breathe. My goodness me. Well, we're going to stop that chapter there. Oh, we've stopped at a very exciting part, haven't we? I can't wait to see what happens next. So, you tune in next time and we'll see if poor Paddington gets out of this situation. He doesn't have to get himself into some bother, doesn't he? Right. So you take care of yourselves and we'll see you next time. But for now, it's a goodbye from Paddington, goodbye from Frank, and a goodbye from me. You take care now. Bye.